Thank you. So first of all, my thesis had the title How to Establish a Market for Automated, Connected, Electric and Shared ACES Vehicles. And as Oliver already told you, I looked especially at the stakeholder perspectives. I will start with a short summary about the idea of ACES, or my idea of ACES I used in the thesis. An ACES vehicle stands for Automated, Connected, Electric and Shared, and owns the following properties. So first of all, it had to own a high automation level. I referred here to the SIE level 4 or 5. For the connected part, it has to communicate with the environment and also other vehicles. And the vehicle itself has to include an electric battery or hybrid drive. And also for the sharing part, it had to fulfill an on-demand access provided by service providers. And for my study, an ACES vehicle has to include all of these 4 attributes to be an ACES vehicle. Why is this topic so important? First of all, current research mainly focuses on technological solutions and problems like data security in the field of connected vehicles. And in terms of the stakeholders, only single perspectives are of interest. That means that there are studies for the acceptance of elderly people on sharing or automation functions, but neither on the other actors as OEMs or suppliers, nor on their relationships or interactions in this whole network. Also, ACES has a practical relevance as it could address negative mobility impacts like congestion or CO2 emissions. And furthermore, the field has a high number of issues that need to be solved. For instance, the technical problems or complexity to advance automation functions. But at the same level, there is a huge number of players involved, which could complicate communication or standardization solutions or how to standardize them. These 2 areas then build the foundation for my research objective that aim to identify the opportunities and barriers for alignment of various stakeholder groups and how a shared understanding can help to reach a sustainable mobility solutions. And overall then the intention was to gain an understanding of stakeholders and the network in which they interact. Finally, the idea was here to identify their perspectives, relationships, and concerns they hold within this network. Then, out of these objectives, the research question was, how can complementary and controversial expectations of various stakeholders be aligned into a shared idea of the future of ACES to secure a rapid joint pathway to more sustainable transportation? Now some information to my research design. For the thesis, I conducted expert interviews, and these were persons or organizations that have a stake in at least one of the components of ACES. This means I talked to associations, for instance, that make research in the field of future mobility solutions, and also that related also to connectivity functions or automation functions or electric drive, but also to classical OEMs that produce the future cars. Beside these primary data source, I also participated at the UCAT Congress in 2021, which was a congress that included discussions of multiple stakeholders from different areas and countries, like politics, OEMs, and suppliers. And they really discussed on a European level about the future of mobility, and also especially on automated and connected functions. One part here was also the CCAM, which means cooperative, connected and automated mobility, as a partnership to handle with the complexity and also to create partnerships between multiple stakeholders from multiple groups. And the participants also communicated here their expectations towards this partnership initiative. And I tried to use these insights from the plenary discussions as secondary data source and to compare it with my expert interviews to see if there are some gaps or if there is unity among the different opinions, or at my local level and also at the European level. So in total, my research setting consisted of 28 expert interviews with different stakeholder groups. And finally, I had 7 groups that consisted, for instance, of OEMs, members from associations or consulting firms, but also some members of research. And my actual guideline I used included 7 different subjects, for instance, opinions towards sustainable mobility, questions towards the stakeholder network, or general barriers and potentials of the ACES technology. And for my sampling strategy, I used snowball sampling as I thought it might be easier to reach experts when they recommend some other experts, as they already act in this network and know how the network works. And me as an external, maybe not so, and that worked quite well. And my analysis took part via coding. Based on this data collection, it was then possible to gain several results. One topic was here definitely the stakeholder network. The interviews helped to define stakeholder roles and relationships for ACES, as well as some of the motives and tensions that occur. In the next step, we learned something about the role of customers. What are their perceived expectations from the viewpoint of other stakeholders, but also what could be a possible customer attitude and potential usage systems for ACES that customers might want. And finally, also the transport sustainability was one results area. And here we found some information about the perception of sustainable transport in general, and then how the contribution of ACES towards the sustainable transport is possible. I will now start with a description of the different stakeholder groups identified and their relationships towards other actors. First of all, you can here see my stakeholder network I created based on the interviews and on the UCAT Congress. In total, we have 22 actors, and each color represents one actor group, so to say, or stakeholder group. And on the right, you can also see the explanations about the groups. The expert interviews showed here that the technology producing actors, you can see on the left side, are the classical actors like OEMs or suppliers, added by new ones as technology companies or startups, which are not necessarily attributed to the automotive industry. Based on their role to produce vehicles, they have then relationships towards the actors the technology has to interact. This means the infrastructure where the car operates in the future, then the capital providers to get the necessary investments, and surely the buyers of the product, which means here, for instance, customers, but also the service providers, which buy the cars to operate with them in the future. Then the next group are the infrastructure providing actors for ACES. And they are not only building the required street infrastructure, experts also see that they are responsible to deliver the energy and the connectivity that is, for instance, required for V2V communications. And therefore, also telecom companies and energy companies are attributed to this stakeholder group. Since their interface role they somehow have here, they have connections to technology producing actors, but also to the service providing actors that have to deal with their attributes. And since the relatively new role, there is also strong relationships to consulting and research actors that provide input for the transformation of the existing structures that is necessary to adapt and be capable of supporting ACES. One next group was then the capital providing actors, where classical banks or investors, but also insurance of vehicle was attributed. And this group was has nearly a connection to all stakeholder groups, as they provide the capital that stakeholders need to run their business, but also to develop the new technology and to run the innovation process. In terms of the direct technology production, it has to say that this group is rather passive, as it is more of creating or enabling the environment for innovation than actively participating in, for instance, the vehicle development. Then the consulting firms and universities were seen as more a neutral actor that provides the necessary ideas and information for other stakeholder groups to deal with the requirement of transformation, but also to change existing structures. And consequently, they more accompany the whole process than actively produce new technologies. And it was interesting because many stakeholders kind of described them as a spider in the web, where they move from the right to the left and are somehow everywhere. Then the next group are the service providers. Many interviewees see the group of service providers ranging from the classical service providers, but also to the public transportation companies that could be interesting for ACES in the future. And in terms of ACES, they are seen as the later operators. This means today we have the customer who owns a car, and for the future, many stakeholders see that the service provider will own the car and the customer have only this on-demand access as implemented in the beginning. And compared to the currently automotive market, they are not so powerful than, for instance, the OEMs. And consequently, they have strong relationships to capital providers and consulting actors as they want to strengthen their position and grow. At the same time, they try to react on customer needs and create a connection to the politic to communicate their influence. Because many interviewees of this group described that they currently have not the power to communicate their problems or call it regulative wishes, what should be simplified to improve their business model, so to say. On the next slide, you see the social actors. It was interesting because here we had a broad range which stakeholders were attributed to this group, because it was one time the classical customers, but also the media, associations, networks, and NGOs. Related to their relationships, it was the case that they were claimed at, they were described to buy the products that OEMs and service providers offer, and also were seen as rather passive than actively can affect anything in the whole development. Finally, we have the relationships of regulative actors, and they were seen as rather two-sided. On the one hand, the relationships provide the framework for operations, technology development, and the legal side. And on the other hand, there is always the danger that one side abuses these relationships and tries to get advantage through its power. So the interviewed experts see this especially the case for OEMs and telecom companies. You can see this here as the red lines as informal relationships, and they kind of describe that it often, the relationship between these actors is too close or somehow influences each other and then abuses the power. To summarize this whole relationship network, As you can see here, we have many complex or many relationships. And on the one hand, we have this rather active stakeholder groups as the infrastructure providing actors or the technology producing actors, or somehow the service providing actors and the regulative actors. But on the other side, we have more the passive stakeholder groups as the capital providing actors, the consulting actors, or the societal actors, and which are somehow included in the development but cannot actively participate in the direct technological production. Yeah, now I'm summarize you the main findings. So first of all, it was important that the societal actors currently do not participate actively in ACES, as I already said, and instead their intrinsic motivation was seen as important, as it can affect ACES implementation negatively. This means if there is no acceptance by the customers, many stakeholders see the problem that then ACES won't work in the long term or won't be as successful as it should be for the companies. Then the sharing of resources and knowledge of stakeholder groups is here important for the relationships to deal with the complexity of the technologies and also to advance the ACES concept. Then it was interesting that the stakeholders interviewed perceived the roles clearer for technology producing actors than for the other actors, as for instance, some of the social actors as the media. And but then it was interesting that when we came back to the customer, that they should be at the heart of ACES, of the ACES network, and should be involved via co-creation. Because again, we come here to somehow to the motivation. If the customer won't accept ACES or doesn't sees his needs fulfilled, then ACES won't work in this construct. Finally, also the service providers and cities, which were only mentioned by some stakeholders as relevant actors, have currently small roles, but although they will be crucial for the broad market implementation for ACES, as I already said, for the service providers, they are attributed to be the operators of ACES, but also the cities who are somehow the environment where the vehicles drive. So these are currently not involved as they should be. Now I come to the dependencies of the ACES stakeholder networks. In total, we have 4 dependency topics. These are technological, capital, regulative, and market dependencies. And as you can see, the technological dependency mainly concerns infrastructural and technology developing actors. As reasons, stakeholders describe the interrelatedness of ACES and their connection. And therefore, it is not possible, for instance, for an OEM to develop an ACES vehicle completely on his own without talking, for instance, to infrastructure providers or tech companies. This means each of these actors has its area of expertise, but they have to bring it together to deal with the complexity and to develop the ACES vehicle, as I already said in the conclusion for the relationships. Then we have the capital providing dependencies. The interviewees see here the main dependency in the huge amounts of investments that are necessary to advance and develop ACES and its components. Consequently, all producing stakeholder groups like infrastructure, technology producing and service providers are dependent from the capital providing actors to get this money, because without this money, it is not possible to advance the concept. But also here the dependency was somehow described as the classical capital and business dependency. So it has not necessarily to deal only with ACES. In the next step, we have the regulative dependency. That means actors have to adapt their way of action based on existing legal frameworks, approval processes, or regulations. And due to the complexity, many experts called for a European regulative framework, because in their opinion, this is necessary to have the possibility to implement ACES on a European level. But also at the same time, current regulative frameworks diverge often across borders. And also, as you can see, compared to the other dependency I just showed you, we have here the highest number of dependency because each of the producing stakeholder groups is somehow dependent of this regulative framework. So it was really interesting that this is the main wish or the main problem at the moment that stakeholders sees where a solution is necessary. At the next time, we have here stakeholder dependencies for the market dependencies. That means that customers are strongly affected by market dependencies as they have to take what's available on the market. And this is also very valid for the service providers. They often described in the interviews that they have problems how they can bring in their opinions or their skills to advance ACES, as they have not the power to influence or to change what the technology producing actors make. And also we have here the market dependency between energy companies and customer. As based on the energy provided, the customer has to take it. So this means for the electric vehicles, if we have not enough energy, then we have a problem. That was somehow the opinion the stakeholders showed up. Then if we summarize the dependencies again in one slide, you can see that we have here especially the infrastructural stakeholder group and also the technology producers that are somehow involved in almost any dependency. But we have also the consulting actors, which are somehow neutral and not involved in any of the described dependency, which is also somehow interesting as they are the supportive actor and the neutral actor. So my evaluation was that this is really possible as they have no dependency, so they can really act where they want and how they want and are not affected by any of the other dependencies or tensions or conflict areas. Now let's move to the conflict areas. We have here again different topics as market, informal, interest, and regulative conflict potentials. And in the field of market conflicts, this is strongly attributed to stakeholders that sell their products on the market. This means in this environment, conflicts can arise due to the competitiveness of brands, as well as the objective to be the first on the market and to sell the product as first company on the market. Due to the role of the service providers, we have this also between the OEM and the service providers because they somehow compete to be the service provider in the future, because an OEM also wants to be a service provider in terms of ACES. Then the regulative conflicts can hinder the technology development itself. For instance, if associations develop new standards that somehow limit current processes or required attributes, then these conflicts always were described to create limits and that they can complicate the innovation process itself. And as you can see, we have here again multiple groups involved, but most strongly again the technology producing actors. Then the biggest conflict potential identified emerged out of the different stakeholder motives. In summary, it was able to identify 3 different groups. The main intention of technology producing actors is to be profitable and sell products on the market. So this was the first side. Customer and societal actors like NGOs claim for more sustainable products and mobility solutions. And additionally, they want to fulfill their needs in the best way possible with the products that are available on the market. This group also shows then their motives that should be taken into account by the politics, or shows the politics what they want and what they claim for. And then the politics or regulating actors, depending on what they create or what legal framework or regulations they make, this can then cause conflicts if this doesn't fit to the social motives, or also limits again the technology producing actors. And then, similar to the dependencies, we have again here a conflict potential based on lobbying, because the reason was here in the interviews that stakeholders see the danger or the fact that the power of single actors not only tries to abuse the power to get advantages out of it, no, it can even stop the whole technological development in one direction. And in terms of ACES, this would mean, for instance, that a telecom company has that huge power or an energy company to hinder one technology to come up, and then this whole concept has to move or to adapt. Then again, if we summarize all the conflict areas, we can see that we have here, especially again, the technology producing actors affected, but also in terms of the motivations, now the societal actors are here. And I think this also is somehow, again, an example of the intrinsic function of this group due to their motives and how these motives can affect the other groups or influence their action. Now, the main findings or summary towards the relationships and dependencies and tensions, sorry. First of all, the dependencies and conflict potentials are higher in the direct technology and innovation environment. As you just saw, we have always affected the technology producing actors and the infrastructural actors by the highest dependency and conflict potentials. Then more concrete, the most dependencies for ACES exist for the automotive supply chain and the service providers. That means how they develop ACES and how they interact with. Then the different motives and regulations are one major cause for tensions between the stakeholder groups, as we just had with the 3 groups, so to say. And then the key conflict areas exist, especially between the groups of societal actors, technology, and regulative actors. And again, lobbying is here a main tension and danger to negatively affect or stop ACES further implementation, or to change it in a way that could not be as supportive for sustainability. So now, for the conclusion, I come back to the sustainability aspect of the research question. I also try to evaluate how ACES potential is to increase sustainability. On the left side, you see the current perception of ACES built on the 3 dimensions: social, economic, and ecological factors that are, or I compared these 3 dimensions from the concept of sustainable transportation, and then looked which ideas the stakeholder groups associated on these 3 dimensions for ACES. So as you can see, we have here high overlaps because the graphic shows which aspects are valid for both concepts. So for instance, for the environment, we see here a contribution to climate change or to reduce the CO2 emissions or less city traffic. But then in the next step, I compared the concept of sustainable transportation and what stakeholders associate within the context of ACES with sustainability. So first of all, it was interesting that there was little awareness of the ACES concept itself in the interviews. But then when looking at the single ACES components, they were already established for all stakeholder groups. So for me, this showed that the combination towards ACES is still a relatively new approach. And also there was no common understanding in priorities and synergy. This means when talking about the potentials or the barriers of ACES, often it was separated. That means stakeholders described this for automation only or for electric vehicles only, but they did not understand or so strongly combine these components and try to look at the whole picture, so to say. Then when looking at the sustainability dimensions, there was agreement that ACES includes sustainability dimensions and can support them. But when asking more or in more detail, it was clear that stakeholders perceive the potential of ACES to increase sustainability, but they perceive not that sustainability is not included in the actual implementation. That means at the moment it is more an idea, but it doesn't represent the actual way of development or how the constructs work. Then how to evaluate this? Again, it was interesting that when we come back to the 3 dimensions, that the stakeholders see huge potential to improve social mobility aspects, as for instance, inclusiveness, access, or security. But then when looking at the ecological dimension, there was more disagreement among actors about how the electric drive especially can contribute to the ecological dimension. But then they saw that ACES may help to reduce the negative ecological impacts in general. That means CO2 emissions, pollution, as I just mentioned before. But then it was interesting because stakeholders mostly link the sustainable contribution of ACES in terms of the ecological dimension to the type of drive. So it was not that they say automation, connectivity, and shared helps to reduce CO2 emission. No, it was mainly attributed to the electric vehicle or an alternative vehicle like hydrogen power. Then we had also some barriers of ACES, contribution to sustainable transport. On the one hand, it was mentioned that the regulation at the moment somehow hinders this sustainability process or the technological or the innovation openness to really drive and advance sustainable mobility solutions. And on the other hand, again, the acceptance problems were mentioned because it was somehow argued that the information flow is not so good, and therefore somehow the customer especially do not understand what this whole development should be, but also the acceptance on the technology producing actors. Then to the main findings about the contribution towards sustainable transport. So first of all, The ACES concept was referred to the dimensions of sustainable development with the dimensions social, ecological, and economic. But there were very divergent definitions of sustainable transportation, as you just saw before. But it was interesting because the main emphasis of stakeholders was on the ecological and social aspects. So the economic dimension was somehow ignored. And they really focused often on one of these two aspects. Then it was interesting because stakeholders see especially the multimodality of transport means as crucial, because they see this as way to determine the actual implementation of ACES. They described it as that ACES alone with vehicles won't work. So they said a mobility or transportation system with ACES has to include multimodality of transport means. That means, for instance, e-scooters or bikes or public transport solutions. And only with this holistic view, ACES will have a future that is really the best one for supporting sustainable mobility. As a conclusion then out of this, at the moment, I would say stakeholders have no common understanding about sustainable transport. And also when referring to ACES, social, ecological, and multimodal approaches are shared by stakeholders as crucial components to support sustainable mobility. Based on these different opinions and these tendencies, I tried then to come up with a new definition that can be used to advance ACES and to support sustainable mobility in this context. And my definition would be: sustainable mobility is a multimodal interaction between different means of transport that enables people to have free mobility choice, access, and security. As the products used require not much energy and resources through their life cycle perspectives, they can contribute to lower CO2 emissions and economical balance. This definition tried here to include especially three aspects: the multimodality, the social dimension, the ecological dimension, with the points the stakeholders mentioned or see as most critical, but also to somehow include this economical balance that is important to successfully run it on the market. Then let's come to the last topic, the stakeholder alignment. So what is the current status of stakeholder alignment? We have currently some areas of agreement. Stakeholders agree that creating partnerships and sharing knowledge is key to advance ACES and even to implement it on the market. Then we have the agreement that the social aspects as inclusiveness, safety is key with ACES, and we have really the potential to improve this one. And also there was often mentioned that stakeholders wish to involve the customers, and also that it is critical to get their acceptance for success and also for market success and further development of the concept. But then on the other side, we have at the moment many areas of disagreement by the different stakeholder groups. So firstly, we have huge barriers as the regulation, the regulative dependencies, conflicts, because these, or to say, the regulative tensions and problems are one major cause for conflict potentials and dependencies at the moment. Then we have missing relationships to certain stakeholders. This means the cities and especially the customers, because as you just saw, they are evaluated as critical to success. But when it comes to the implementation, they are rather passive and cannot influence the actual implementations or development of ACES solutions. Then we have the technology producing stakeholders that have to produce this really complex technology, but also they had the highest complexity and tensions in this whole stakeholder networks and in their relationships. So they are kind of in between two very, very huge problems. Then we have the divergence in stakeholders' understanding of sustainable transportation, as you just saw. So we have no common understanding. We have these two sides where the focus is on, but no common way at the moment. And currently also we have a high divergence about the right solution. So especially when we look at the electric drive or the usage system, it became clear that there is much doubt, especially when it comes to the energy source, for instance, for electric vehicles. So this means at the moment, yeah, stakeholders tend to have different opinions what about the right solution of ACES, and therefore maybe the concept is kind of insecure at the moment still. And then based on this agreements and disagreements, I tried to come up with ideas how to achieve stakeholder alignment or how to create more areas of agreements between stakeholders. First of all, it is important to reduce these existing barriers, especially the regulative ones, as they have the chance then to balance existing tensions and conflict areas, but also this then in consequence could increase the potential for stakeholder alignment. Then we have the relationships with cities and customers, include their opinions, because ACES has to be adapted to customer needs. Also, it is then possible to share knowledge and resources and to create or enable this co-creative environment to work together to really develop the best solution. Then we should look at a concept that includes especially technological openness. This was mentioned especially in research contexts in the interviews or by research stakeholders, that only with this flexibility and technological openness it is possible to develop the best solution for sustainability and also for the customer. So this means ACES should reach to stay somehow flexible in its innovation process. Then in the next step, we should create a common understanding about the intention and also the impact of ACES. This is necessary to develop a common vision to support sustainable mobility, to develop a common idea how it should look like in the future, but also that it's possible that stakeholders pull their resources together and not work separately and go in different directions. And last but not least, it is important to create awareness for important aspects. This is important, or this is especially the partnerships that are seen as key, that are important to also to share resources and knowledge in this environment. Then that ACES is only accepted if it addresses customer needs, so that we always have to keep in mind the connection to the customer and also to society, what they want and how it is possible to implement this or to look at this or include these aspects. And finally, that it is important to develop multimodal solutions because they are necessary to support sustainable mobility, but also to support this ACES in a whole transportation system environment, and that not only the vehicle is required to change to be more sustainable, no, it's the whole transportation system. Okay, then one final remark. Based on my thesis, I then identified new research gaps that might be interesting to look at in the future to get further insight about the topic. So first of all, I think it's important to find out how to include customers in co-creation processes of high technology products, because when I look at the literature, this is especially described for customer goods or service goods or the service economy, but not so often in that complex products as vehicles or automation functions. Secondly, which processes and actors are included in mobility regulations for ACES? I think this is especially important as the study showed that regulation is main cause for tensions, for conflicts, has a huge complexity. And also if we want a European implementation of ACES, then to deal with it or to develop the right solution, it is important to know the processes and the responsible stakeholders, to talk to them and maybe to get to have a faster process. Thirdly, what expectations and requirements do cities possess to solve mobility problems based on their history? I had here the idea to look one step closer at cities because they are the environment where the cars later will operate. But also cities often have this individual background based on their history. If we look at some of the European cities, they have their roots in the Middle Ages. So I think it is necessary to get more knowledge about these structures, as ACES is so complex by itself, to learn how it is possible to come together here based on this given infrastructure and the new technology. And the last point, what political structures are necessary or useful to support sustainable mobility with ACES? This also somehow referred to the second point of the regulation, but here I had more the idea of what is really possible or what is needed to develop ACES, because in the interviews it often emerged that it should not be allowed anymore to drive a car or to own a car. Others said it is important to solve the problem with innovation and not with regulation. So is it really possible to have here democratic structures or market structures, or what is needed here for the best way? Yeah. So that was the last point. Thank you for your attention.